Hello and welcome to another tutorial from trainingps.com. I thought it'd be a good idea before we go any further with these tutorials is to give you an idea of what I'm using for my preferences in Photoshop. So let's go ahead and get it going in Photoshop. Command or Control K will bring up the preferences. Or under General, I leave things alone. Under Color Picker, HUD Color Picker, I go with the Hue Wheel Medium instead of the Hue Strip. If you don't use it, by the time you start watching these videos, you will want to use it. So you can kind of play around with it. Let me show you what it does real quick. If you were to hold in the Control, Alt, or Option command on a Mac under Brush and click, you're going to get a color wheel. And you can pick any color you want, any shade of that you want, right on the fly. So it's a great option available, so I would definitely recommend it. Let's go on. Image interpolation bicubic is what I'm using 90% of the time, 99% of the time. I will go to smoother if I'm doing an enlargement, but there are plugins now that work really well for doing enlargement, so I generally just use those. Options under General, I leave everything alone except for Export Clipboard. And the reason I turn that off is because I don't know if you've ever been working in Photoshop and you've got something copied and you go to close and you'll get an annoying little message that comes up telling you about the clipboard. If you just uncheck this, that goes away. Under Interface, Standard Screen Mode, I'm using a custom color. And the color I am using is actually 252, 252, 252. Which is just right next to white, and I like that because I can preview my picture on the white, see contrast and things, and then if I want I can go straight gray or I can do black. So it gives me 3 different options for viewing my picture. I leave the other 2 alone, as I just said. I'm leaving all the other options here as is. The UI text options for font size, I do medium. I believe small is default. Under file handling, image previews always save. Append file extension always. Let's go down to camera raw preferences. I let it do the sidecar XMP file, and that's if you're bringing it in and you're saving it as a Photoshop file. It will add this little file right along with it. I've started using DNG, which is Adobe's format, and it takes this information and it adds it in with it so you don't get the extra file, and I found that just easier for me, and Adobe is never gonna stop offering the DNG, so why not? I leave all this alone down here. Everything gets kept the same. Automatically open JPEGs with settings, all this. So we're just going to go ahead and say OK to that. I leave these options alone. Under maximize PSD and PSB file compatibility, I like always. It's defaulted at ask, and that's just an annoying message you get. And what the difference is if you maximize PSD compatibility and you're working with a program like Lightroom, it will read the picture. You'll see the icon. It will import properly. If you have not been saving it maximized, it will not work in Lightroom correctly. So just as a habit, I do always, because a lot of my workflow goes from Lightroom, exported into Photoshop, and then it gets brought back into Lightroom at the end. Performance. This is probably the biggest tab here, and where I like to be is right at 70%. That's where Adobe has defaulted it, and after a lot of testing people have done, bumping it up just kind of decreases your performance, and 70% is right at the sweet spot. The history and the cache, big and fat, that's if you're working with big files. Default is where they keep it at. If you start working with these big digital cameras though, you want big and fat, because when you start saving multiple layers, I've noticed on my machine, it will lag, and it will lag as it saves. But if I just take this to big and fat using these settings. It zips right along when it's saving it. There's no problem whatsoever. Under scratch disk, I'm using 24 gigs of RAM in my computer, so it's kind of irrelevant for me from what I've noticed. I don't even bother with it. I've got all these other hard drives I could be using, but this doesn't speed it up enough for me to worry. I go ahead and let the OpenGL work. I have a pretty decent video card, so it does help. If you've noticed that your computer is lagging even after you do these settings, try to uncheck this and see if as you're working it speeds up, because some video cards don't work as well as others. So that's an option you do have. Under cursors, the only thing I change here is I go from standard to precise because I want that exact point. All these are left the same. Under units and rulers though, I do change it to inches. I believe it's set to pixels as default or centimeters, but inches is what most people work in is when they're doing pictures. They want an 8x10 or a 5x7. Everything's done in inches, so you might as well leave it there. Guides, you can change the color of them if you want. These don't make big differences. Plugins, I recommend you leave it as it is. There's no need to change plugin folders because everything's just going to get messed up that way. So just leave all that alone. Type, font preview, medium, that's default. And 3D, I leave all that alone. I don't use 3D very often, but when I do, the only thing I might change is go to Ray Tracer instead of OpenGL, and it gives you a little bit of a faster preview. But that would be the only thing I would do every once in a while. So those are my preferences. The only other thing I might be changing when I'm doing a picture is in the camera raw itself, and I'll show you this. We'll close this picture out here real quick. Possibly. There we go. And we'll pull up a raw negative here. And down here in the bottom, if you're working with a portrait and you want the maximum possible quality that you can work with, take your depth up to 16-bit. It's going to increase your file size, but it's going to give you a lot more leeway as far as working with the image. And resolution, regardless, just work on 300. Sharpen for none. You could do the sharpening yourself. You don't need Photoshop to do it for you. Under the color space, I use the Adobe RGB. I know some people prefer the Pro Photo. sRGB if you're sending it out to the web, but you can convert that at the end. But for workflow, Adobe RGB is a great way to go. You can also check here and have it open as a smart object, and we'll get into that in another episode. But that's where your information is down there, and that's the only other thing I might change. I hope you enjoyed this video, and look for more at trainingps.com.